Winter in Port Hacking is usually a quiet time for shore, sea and water birds, but not this year. Sometimes there are no eastern curlews that stay the winter, usually maybe one or two, sometimes up to 5 for a short period of the winter. This year, 14 eastern curlews stayed instead of going off to their subarctic breeding grounds in northern China and Russia. Why? It could be a number of reasons. Port Hacking was dredged for the first time in 11 years, and it was disturbing feeding and resting eastern curlews at a critical time in their life cycle. In February, they need to eat and rest a lot more than usual in order to double their body weight to fuel their non-stop flight that can take over a week to reach their staging areas around the Yellow Sea. The dredge disturbance combined with the summer holidays disturbance may have prevented them putting on enough weight to attempt migration. They could also have been juvenile birds too young to breed or mature birds too old to breed. Mid-August saw the eastern curlews that migrated start to return. They come back looking very slim and compete with each other and have to fight with the silver gulls to collect food. As at the 10th of September, the 14 overwintering birds were joined by returning eastern curlews, taking their count up to 23. This is the first time since I've been surveying eastern curlews that we've had more birds after a migration than we had before. The migratory bird's roost site has eroded, which we are still working to have restored. Sometimes the birds tried roosting on the main spit beach, but often they were disturbed, which saw them fly over to Botany Bay for their roosting cycle. When they returned for the next feeding cycle, sometimes an overwintering bar-tailed godwit would come with them. The migratory shorebird's feeding cycle is being compromised by one local that spends every day, almost the entire feeding cycle, with her on-leash dog. Eastern curlews are territorial and don't like sharing a feeding space. She travels the entire feeding area, pushing birds out of their space, forcing them into another's territory, and then fights break out between the birds. Marine environments are dynamic and in a constant state of change, and 3 years ago we had a channel realignment that saw a change in where the Cabbage Tree Creek exits. That change, which ended the spit beach, was the busy end and caused our New Zealand bird visitors, the double-banded plovers, which used to be our regular winter visitors, to rarely be seen. This year that changed, and we saw them more often than not. Like the eastern curlews, they weren't always able to roost here in Port Hacking, but they were mostly successful midweek. Black swans are a rare sight in Port Hacking these days. This year, however, I recorded up to 52. According to Chris Purnell, Birdlife Australia's Wetland Birds Program Manager, big numbers of black swans are being noted in coastal and lagoon settings around the eastern seaboard. There was almost continuous opportunistic breeding recorded since early 2020, and the birds being noted are dispersing to new areas as the inland starts to dry. We noted them start to appear in May, and by early September most had continued on to a habitat that better suited them. Juvenile pelicans were also noted arriving into Sydney. Our local turtle and seabird rescue carer had 8 juveniles in care that had arrived from their inland areas, malnourished and exhausted. After a stint of rehab at her rescue resort, they were released into Port Hacking to mix with the adult pelicans. Pied stilts are rare visitors to Port Hacking, but this year we saw one adult bird with 4 juveniles spend a day doing a driver-reviver type rest stop. They arrived in around dawn and found a spot that protected them from the wind to have a long rest, grab some food, before continuing on to a more preferable habitat. White-bellied seagulls and ospreys nest along the Hacking River estuary. This year saw the osprey family regularly resting and feeding on the spit beach on the installations that people construct from the washed-in timber rack. The masked lapwings took advantage of the early warm weather during August and decided to nest early. They had a nest of 3 eggs, but only one was viable. They nested on the busiest bit of beach without a fence or signage, and for the first time in over a decade were successful hatching a chick on the beach. After the chick hatched, they sat on the remaining eggs for 2 more days before deciding to go with the one chick they had. They encouraged it off the beach to take it into the campgrounds and mangrove area, which would offer it more protection.